is animated by a central question, and that's how to love in an era of extinction. And we're going to slowly unpack what that question means. So in the book, I talk about a lot of my own liaisons in multi-species worlds, platonic, but definitely full of love, with the fringe-toed foam frog, chytrid fungi that have parasexual liaisons, as well as my favorite ant, Ectotoma ruidum. But instead of talking about my own love affairs today, I'm going to talk about multi-species families, people that bring animals into their houses and develop all sorts of attachments to them. So I'm going to tell you about primarily three kinds of pets that people keep. I'm going to talk about snakes, I'm going to talk about birds, and then towards the end, I'm going to get towards frogs again, and tell you how you can get your own endangered frog. So today we'll explore queer forms of kinship that have emerged in these multi-species households, where some animals are treated as people. I'm going to talk about the home economics of these families in Florida, where I found some hopeful stories where capitalism and desires pinned on unusual modes of life generated surprising emergences. I'll tell you stories of lively capital. So rather than sort of reject capitalism as this thing that we can only oppose, I'm going to look at possibilities that emerge when we start buying, selling, and breeding animals. So this phrase, lively capital, comes from Donna Haraway, who is one of my mentors, and she describes it as something where commerce and consciousness, evolution and bioengineering come together with ethics of mutual utility that create new possibilities of life. So rather than think about relationships with other forms of life as just strictly outside of the realms of use, what sort of possibilities emerge when we start using others? Is there an ethics that could be developed in this space of mutual utility? So some kinds of animals are amenable to being incorporated into human households. People often treat animals like they're human, and there's some forms of life that share our norms about sociality, our desires for touch. But there's other kinds of animals that don't. There's animals that, if they're treated as persons in a human household, will die. So in part, it's exploring these different species-specific stories of possible flourishings in a human house. So some creatures, as I'll discuss today, like these birds here, are pretty personable. But things like snakes and some frogs don't fit so well within the human desire to have these intimate connections. So I'll be talking about various forms of connection that we might foster in these households. So I'm going to tell you a lot about Caroline Elliott, a woman who I met in South Florida. She lives in a suburb of Miami in a double-wide mobile home. And she basically breeds exotic birds. She calls these birds her babies. And when I first went to her house, I thought that she was just sort of projecting human anthropocentric norms on these birds, that they were sort of projection screens for things that she thought about forms of life. So her mobile home is kind of chaotic. Along with assorted bird cages throughout her backyard, I found salvaged lawnmowers, motorcycles, and golf carts. One of her favorite babies, Myrtle, a Hans macaw, readily engages in mimetic play, so sort of copying human speech and parroting it back. Here's some dialogue that I found when I visited her house. Caroline, she says, "Myrtle, want a grape?" Myrtle says, "Quillarockow." Caroline, "No, it's not cold, it's warm out." "Want to sing like Nana? Sing." "Ah, ah, 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 ah." "Sing, Myrtle." "Nah, it's not cold out." Myrtle, "Ah, ah, 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 ah. Want an apple?" Caroline laughs. "Give Nana a kiss." And then the bird approaches her mouth and makes a little kissing gesture as it touches its beak to the mouth. Right before they get to your mouth, Caroline explains, they'll open their beak and just kind of push at your lip. But some birds are biters. And what she does is she scours Craigslist. She looks at, she goes to flea markets and looks at classified ads in the newspaper and looks for birds that are biters. And then she tries to teach those biters how to be better people. And then she sells them for added value on the internet. Friends call Caroline the bird whisperer because of her ability to work with animals that often animals that are often like in other households, like the biters, the ones that are regarded as the mean birds. Since she injured her back and was forced into early retirement, she's sustained her whole household by breeding, buying, and selling these birds. So she's teaching them to appreciate our own rules, our own sensibilities about politeness, touch, regard, and response. She's transforming these babies into human social beings who are attentive to our needs and our desires. But in doing so, she's actually adding value to these animals as commodities on the open market. David Schneider, who's an anthropologist who's written about kinship, talks about how kinship involves the socialization of biological processes. He's playing with the boundaries of Caroline is playing with the boundaries of kinship, mixing biological and social relations in creative ways. She was always ready to draw new people and new birds into a flexible family network. While we were interacting with Myrtle, as I'm sort of recording this dialogue, a phone call arrives from Jean, and Caroline picks up. Jean is the former owner of another bird in her household named Polly, who's a red-shouldered macaw. And you can see the macaw up there on the left. Jean is like my sister, Caroline later explained. She's interested in doing trades. I love doing trades, especially with her. She's a thing, 2 for 1. I give her 1 bird and she gives me 2. And the basic deal is that Jean gives birds that are biters, 2 of them, and then Caroline gives 1 bird that's a good person back. So this phone call gave Caroline an opportunity to describe her skills as a bird whisperer, a savvy entrepreneur, a social networker. These 2 for 1 deals were on offer because she was, again, capable of making the birds more sociable and more personable. Caroline was talking about this extended network of her fictive kin, and as she was talking, an Australian budgie named Peeps flew up to her hand. So she's just talking with me, and Peeps, the bird, is sitting on her hand. All of a sudden, Peeps starts to waggle his tail really quick, all the while clutching her hand, and then all of a sudden, he flies away, and there's a little spot of liquid with blood in the middle. Basically, I just witnessed interspecies sex. Here's this old retired lady, and she doesn't miss a beat. She just keeps talking to me about her babies as if nothing happens, picks up a paper towel, and wipes it off. So I'm going to read a selection of an essay by one of my colleagues at Princeton. His name is Peter Singer. Has everyone heard of Peter Singer? Do we have any vegans in the room? So Peter Singer is known in the circles of animal rights for being sort of writing the defining books about animal liberation. His books have inspired a whole generation of people to stop eating meat. But this essay is a little more controversial. His work in animal rights is definitely controversial. This essay is called Heavy Petting. I'm just going to read it, and hopefully you don't get too scandalized by my eminent colleague at Princeton. Not so long ago, any form of sexuality not leading to the conception of children was seen, at best, as wanton lust, or worse, as perversion. One by one, these taboos have fallen. The idea that it could be wrong to use contraception in order to separate sex from reproduction is now just quaint. If some religions still teach that masturbation is, quote, self-abuse, that it just shows how that it shows how out of touch these religions have become. Sodomy, that's all part of the joy of sex, recommended for couples seeking erotic variety. In many of the world's great cities, gays and lesbians can be open about their sexual preferences, to an extent unimaginable a century ago. You can even do it in the US Armed Forces, as long as you don't talk about it. Oral sex? Some objected to President Clinton's choice of place and partner. Others thought he should have been more honest about what he had done. But no one dared suggest that it was unfit to be president simply because he'd taken part in a sexual activity that was, in many jurisdictions, a crime. But not every taboo has crumbled. Heard anyone chatting at parties lately about how good it is to have sex with their dog? Probably not. Sex with animals is still definitely a taboo. If Midas Decker's offer of Dearest Pet had got it right, this is not because of its rarity. Deckers is a Dutch biologist and a popular naturalist, and he's assembled a substantial body of evidence to show that humans have often thought of love for animals in ways that go beyond a pat and a hug, or proper concern for the welfare of other species. His book has a wide range of illustrations, going back to the Swedish rock drawing from the Bronze Age of a man having sex with a large quadruped of an indeterminate species. There's a Greek vase from 1520 BC showing a male figure having sex with a stag. 17th century Indian miniature of a deer mounting a woman. An 18th century European engraving of an ecstatic nun copulating with a donkey, while other nuns look on, smiling. There's a 19th century Parisian painting of a soldier, also with a donkey, and from the same period a Japanese drawing of a woman enveloped by a giant octopus. How much of this is fantasy, the King Kongish archetypes of an earlier age? In the 1940s, Kinsey asked 20,000 Americans about their sexual behavior and found that 8% of males and 3.5% of females stated that they had at some time had a sexual encounter with an animal, much like Carolyn and Peace. Among men living in rural areas, this figure shot up to 50%. About half of all men interviewed in rural areas reported some sort of sex with an animal. The existence of sexual contact between humans and animals and the potency of this taboo against it displays the ambivalence of our relationship with animals. On the one hand, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, less so in the East, we have always seen ourselves as being distinct from animals. Imagine that, oh wait, and I'm still reading Peter Singer, by the way, and this is Peter Singer. That's what he looks like. So, let's see. There's this distinction made in the Judeo-Christian that imagines this wide, unbridgeable gulf that separates us from animals. Humans alone are made in the image of God. Only human beings have an immortal soul. On the other hand, there's many ways in which we can't help behaving just as animals do, or at least as mammals. And sex is one of the most obvious ones. We copulate as they do. The taboo on sex with animals may, as Peter Singer has suggested elsewhere, originated as part of a broader rejection of non-reproductive sex. But the vehemence with which this prohibition continues to be held, its persistence while other non-reproductive sexual acts have become acceptable, suggests that there's another powerful force at work, our desire to differentiate ourselves, erratically and in every other way, from animals. Almost a century ago, when Sigmund Freud published his groundbreaking essay on sexuality, the Viennese writer Odo Sequoia published a fiery little volume called Beyond the Boundary of Morals. It was never widely known, and it's now forgotten, but this polemic was directed against the prohibition of so-called unnatural sex, like bestiality, homosexuality, fetishism, and other non-reproductive acts. So Sequoia saw that these prohibitions he was railing against these prohibitions, saying that they were futile and misguided attempts to limit the inexhaustible variety of human sexual desire. Only bestiality, he argued, should be illegal, and even then, only so far as it shows cruelty towards animals. Sequoia's suggestion indicates one good reason why some acts described in this book that illustrated all those pictures that I was talking about earlier are clearly wrong and should remain crimes. Some men use hens as a sexual object, inserting their penis into the cloaca, an all-purpose channel for wastes and the passage of the egg. This is usually fatal to the hen, and in some cases she will deliberately be decapitated just before ejaculation. This is cruelty, clear and simple. But it is worse for the hen than living a year in more crowded conditions of factory farming with 4 or 5 other hens in a barren wire cage, so small that they can never stretch their wings, and then being stuffed into crates to be taken to the slaughterhouse, strung upside down on a conveyor belt and killed. If not then, it is no longer worse. If it is this cruelty in that act of sex towards a hen is no worse than what egg producers do to their hens all the time. Again, this is Peter Singer's words. But sex with animals does not always involve cruelty, he also contends. Who has not been, at a social occasion, disrupted by the household dog gripping the legs of a visitor and vigorously rubbing itself up against them? So in addition to that story that I just told you about Caroline and the budgie named Peeps, in my research I also encountered queer forms of interspecies sex involving these birds. There was a budgie named Cooter that lived in a household with Alyssa, and she liked to rub herself on Alyssa's hand and the banister, and then would lay eggs. A well-known Dutch curator told me about his male scarlet macaw that liked to land on his own body when he was touching himself. These queer multi-species families that I'm trying to describe are queer in the sense that they are based on relationships involving choice and love. Biological ties are often decentered in gay and lesbian notions of kinship, and this is according to Kath Weston, who's written a book about families we choose. So she's basically written about, in the context of San Francisco, many young men and women who were abandoned by their biological parents after they came out of the closet, but that formed their own affiliations, their own families based on choice and love. So in multi-species families, choice is often asymmetrical. Humans are keeping other animals in conditions of captivity. But still, these critters that are folded into human families often choose to reciprocate by returning the love, the affection, the social advances of other household members. Imagining new forms of relatedness, Janet Siskind argues, sociability is pan-human, pan-primate, and pan-mammalian. This is something we share with a lot of other kinds of life. But the molding of this sociability into forms of kinship and marriage is not intrinsic and external. And we can potentially get beyond, conventions like marriage and the nuclear family. We can discard it like a chrysalis of a butterfly emerging as it becomes an adult. As people project concepts of kinship beyond the realm of primates and mammals, some creatures obviously share our sensibilities about sociability. In other words, certain species are more flexible as persons than others. So this notion of flexible personhood, and that's the other sort of theory term I've got up on the slide. So I already introduced lively capital as this way that you can sort of make money and use animals while taking ethics and evolution into account. This notion of flexible personhood is a way of thinking about pets in human households. So this comes from an Israeli anthropologist who's written basically about how we address animals as members of our household. So much like Caroline talking about her babies. She's mostly written about dogs and about how dogs are often afforded all sorts of privileges, especially in a young couple. When you have a dog in your house and you don't have a baby, it's often treated as a baby. But then when an actual baby comes along, very often that dog is put out back, or in extreme cases, abandoned by the roadside or taken to the shelter. Every year, thousands of animals are brought to the Humane Society, where they're often killed or held in these cages if they can't find new homes. So this notion of flexible personhood is trying to think about the ways that we endow animals with rights as people, suddenly to take them away when someone goes off to college, when there's a divorce, when there's a death in the family. All of these contingent relations in human social worlds can have very profound impacts for animals that we care for. So this notion of flexible personhood also builds on theories about capitalism. David Harvey, one of my former colleagues at the CUNY Grad Center in Manhattan, talks about flexible strategies for accumulating and selling things. And I think you can use sort of David Harvey's model for thinking about capitalism to think about what's going on here with these animals, and in particular in Caroline's household. So by breeding birds, Caroline was adapting to sweeping changes in political and economic landscapes. At the time when I was interviewing her, there was high unemployment and low property values in the housing market. Many entrepreneurs like her were breeding animals and trading them through informal economic networks, simply to survive. While interviewing these entrepreneurs in Florida and other parts of the United States, I found a large community of people who are caring for these birds, endangered frogs, snakes, and lizards in their own homes. Capital investment is necessary to get breeding projects off the ground. They have to create specialized shelters. They have to get veterinary care, often from reptile and bird experts, which is really costly. And even just feeding the animals, it can also be a major cost. Providing entertainment, love, and affection for these animals also involves difficult daily labor. But these flexible labor processes have enabled a diversity of people to channel their love and passion for particular species into money-making ventures. As a result, spectacular forms of life are multiplying in people's garages, studios, and apartments. There are emerging ecological communities within human-dominated landscapes. So part of my book is about these broad-scale transformations that humans have wrought on the environment. And I'm trying to think about, can interspecies love be a story of hope? There's a lot of writing out there and a lot of activists and campaigners who are trying to shut down the pet trade, saying that the trade in endangered and exotic species is part of what's contributing to extinction events. But what I'm trying to explore, that critique is out there, and this whole talk is situated within it. But are there possibilities of hope? Can we shift that mass death that goes along with collecting birds, collecting frogs, collecting snakes in the wild? Can we create these spaces in our own homes that sort of are shared spaces of hope and happiness and love? So Caroline also introduced me to Dale, a bird that's called a Burke. And Dale is one of her friendliest babies. As Dale flew around the back porch, comfortably perching on my shoulder, Caroline revealed that some of her improvisation and play involved tinkering with the genetic building blocks of life. Dale is a good boy, she said, but birds like him don't exist in the wild. Birds are normally all blue, not this striking red and yellow, like this rubino. Caroline was showing me this genetic calculator that she found online for the Burke genetics. It's an online tool for do-it-yourself geneticists. And this online tool features a mutation gallery that illustrates the effects of different dominant and recessive genes. So if you've taken basic biology class, sort of like Mendel's experiments with peas, you can inherit certain traits that are recessive, that are hidden in a certain generation, but you have to do all sorts of fancy crossbreeding to get colors and traits to pop out. And she's doing similar sort of work here. This calculator that she found lets you enter the genetic characteristics of the parents. So for example, if the parents have recessive genes for cinnamon, or FD for faded, as well as dominant genes like V for violet or D for dark. And you basically enter all these traits of the parents into this calculator, and you hit return, and it predicts what the kids are going to look like. Caroline also showed me pedigrees that she made, which look like human family trees, and she uses these pedigrees to keep track of the genes. So she knows that if she seeks to have babies with a certain trait, like Cin for cinnamon, she needs to breed two adults that both carry the recessive version of the gene. So when you have a recessive gene, like for blue eyes, you can have someone with brown eyes, two parents with brown eyes. Half of the children will have blue eyes, half of the children will have brown eyes. And this is a similar sort of dynamic at work with these birds. So this do-it-yourself ethos of animal breeding has resulted in the creation of makeshift family laboratories where age-old principles of genetics are coming together with new technologies like that calculator and also genetic testing technologies for making sense of DNA. Contemporary animal breeders like Caroline are using practices that grew out of 19th century European methods for calculating fitness, for documenting reproductive performance, and making money with financial instruments. So emergent genomics technologies are also giving people like Caroline more tools for their breeding experiments. she showed me these little packets that she'd got online from Brazil, and she'd figure out what they said by using Google Translate. Basically, she figured out that you could stick a feather or a bit of eggshell in these packets in the mail, send them off to Brazil, pay $7, and they would come back with a gender identification, the species identification, as well as like details that would help you reconstruct a pedigree. So it cost her $7 to do that. So she started selling them like these testing kits on the internet for $30 and offering translation services. So she collected feathers and eggshells from everybody all throughout the States, mailed them off to Brazil, and made like $23 on each transaction. She's an entrepreneur and an enterprising individual. So this testing company also, in addition to giving stable species identities to birds, it also lets you track the hybridity of species. So part of what Caroline's doing is mixing and matching different kinds of birds, creating new kinds of life in her mobile home. So some of her breeding experiments have resulted in the production of birds that are identifiably sick. She showed me these birds in her house. And there's a certain ambivalence that underpins some of her experiments. These are freshly hatched cockatiels whose closely related parents had won prizes at bird shows. So getting new colorful offspring from them could result in a lot of money. She said, I think this is a problem because their parents are too closely related, so I'm going to separate the parents. I'm generally against it breeding relatives, but everyone with show birds promotes inbreeding, saying, oh no, you can't bring in outside birds outside of this show circuit. But after what's going on with these two, I don't think I'm going to breed relatives ever again. How would you feel if every time you had a baby, it died? At the same time, Caroline appeals to claims of authority with direct access to the science of genetics. Some of her breeding experiments are also undermining taxonomic scientists. So taxonomists are the ones that classify species, that divide up different forms of life into stable categories. And she was doing some breeding experiments to undermine that. She told me about her intention to cross a Nande conure with a sun conure to produce a hybrid, a creature called a Sunday conure in the pet trade. And the species name for those two birds are Aratinga nande and Aratinga solitalius. So like many different species of the same genus, they can actually hybridize and produce fertile offspring. These birds have been separated by long periods of geography and history. One of them is from the mainland of South America, and one is from an island in the Caribbean. And she was bringing together these birds and creating new things. So some people in online bird breeding forums are fiercely against that kind of hybridization. They defend the sanctity of species boundaries, even though these colorful hybrids continue to fetch top dollars in the market. This market values novel and rare forms. Caroline takes the pleasure in the confusion of some species boundaries, but she also makes arguments for responsibility in maintaining other distinctions. She has ethical commitments centered on the welfare of individual animals, and rather than absolutely defending all species boundaries as they're drawn up by taxonomists, she's, getting creative a little bit, mixing and matching things that might go well together. Still, she's mindful of these problems that can emerge, like this one here, when certain species boundaries are irresponsibly crossed. She told me about one of her birds named April, a bird that she'd rescued. The guy who gave her April said that the parents pushed April out of the nest, and that messed up her hip. But after doing a little research, Caroline concluded that all of that kind of hybrid bird, the crossing of a peach-fronted conure with a sun conure, would result in a hybridity that would produce that hip deformity. So she basically, started on the online forum saying, like, nobody should do this ever again. Don't produce these birds that are going to be sick. And she told me she would never deliberately create a bird with known genetic problems. So as I experienced the full tour of Caroline's double-wide mobile home, I noted that there were some species of birds, the macaws, the African greys, the birks, and the conures, that were more flexible as persons than others. Some individual birds, like Myrtle, with her ready ability to mimic human speech and social responsiveness, were more personable than others. To play with my own jargon, I found that these birds were interacting with other beings in multi-species worlds. So interaction is a way of thinking about relations that involve changes to everyone involved. So if interaction is like billiard balls, pool balls bouncing off each other, just sort of changing the line that they're traveling on, an intra-action produces some sort of change in everyone. So Caroline herself was changed. You know, she couldn't go out as much anymore. She definitely couldn't take a vacation unless she found someone responsible who was able to live in her household and feed all those birds. And definitely the birds themselves were being changed too, both by being bred in new kinds of ways, but also being changed in terms of their social relations, their expectations for contact, desire for human touch. So in contrast to the macaws, the African greys, the birks, and the conures, there were other birds in her house that were less sociable with people. There were finches, doves, parakeets, and cockatiels that didn't want to touch people or interact or have any sort of response and interaction. And for those reasons, I think Caroline was attached to some of her babies more than others. Even still, in tough economic times, she could not always ignore the exchange value of some of her most treasured loved ones. She cried when she told me about selling Randy, again, a macaw, and macaws are really personable. She sold him for $5,000, and this was to pay an overdue medical bill. Like many other bird enthusiasts who I interviewed, she was attached to these animals who were part of their family. And that isolated moment with Peeps was unusual. I think, in her household, it was mostly a platonic thing. And this was, and I sort of take that encounter where Peeps mounted her hand as evidence that it's not just sort of human projections onto these animals, but that they were sort of loving us back, right? So that was like an example of erotic love that might stand in for, these shared spaces of sociability and happiness. So there's that one sort of outstanding example from her household, but mostly it was just birds, doing that kiss thing, or sitting on her hand to eat food. She would sing to them, they would sing back. So everybody I talked to in these worlds understood that animals and their family were vulnerable. They were vulnerable to sudden shifts amongst humans in the house. Again, with a death or a divorce, a lost job, or a child headed away to school, the status of these prized birds could suddenly be demoted. So that's that notion of flexible personhood again. And that presents an opportunity for someone like Caroline. So she's always on the lookout for those orphaned animals that, circumstances in someone's unhappy tragedy, a death or a divorce, become an opportunity. She becomes sort of the caregiver for these animals that have been orphaned in this urban landscape. Sometimes sudden shifts in human households give the animals themselves the opportunity for freedom. One person told me, on the condition of strict anonymity and confidentiality, about how her enraged husband opened up all the bird cages one Saturday while she was out at the beach with her friends. The husband had grown tired of the incessant squawks and screeches and could not convince her to sell the birds. They have since divorced, and now she's assembled a new multi-species family as a single mom with both birds and kids to take care of. But she imagines that her loved ones that escaped are now flourishing. And she pulled the Peterson's Bird Guide to Florida off the shelf, and she opened up the page to parrots and parakeets. And she showed me that the only member of this family, the parrot family that was native to North America, the Carolina parakeet, is now extinct. It was last seen in the wild in 1920. So the Carolina parakeet is no longer with us. but there's a diversity of others that have taken its place. By last count, there are 72 species of parrots in Florida living in the wild. So that's endless varieties of lorikeets, lories, galas, budgies, cockatoos, macaws, lovebirds, in addition to parrots and parakeets. So an ecology is emerging there as a result of these unhappy accidents in human households, as enraged husbands are freeing birds because they don't like the squawks. They're letting them go. So my anonymous source told me that she's amused that her own broken family has created the possibility for new hybrid families. Her husband released golden conures, which is an endangered bird from Brazil, which have the ability to hybridize with closely related species. So in Florida, that bird is hybridizing with the Hispaniola parakeet, as well as the orange-fronted parakeet. So some designer babies, like the ones that Caroline has created, are also escaping. Florida's become home for diverse animals that were once, again, separated by geography and history. New kinds of life are emerging within these contact zones, giving rise to new symbiotic associations. Even as some state officials are talking about killing invasive species. There's things like monkeys in Florida. That's another chapter of my book, wild monkeys that have been there for 80 years and have run wild. There aren't campaigns, though, to kill these birds. Pretty much the consensus in Florida is that they add a new, interesting dimension to the local flora and fauna. These multi-species foraging flocks are now a common sight of parrots and parakeets gone wild. And here in New Jersey and New York, there's also a few kinds of parrots that have figured out how to overwinter. There's a great film about San Francisco, The Parrots of Telegraph Hill, that talk about one man's love affair with parrots in this urban place. And we see the fickle play of human love and desire and capital at work in these emergent ecological communities. So I'm going to also talk about other forms of life that don't do so well in human households. So while I was in Florida, I went to the Daytona Reptile Expo, where they mostly are focused on these very high-value snakes. So that there is a chondropython from West Papua. If you breed a new variety of chondropython, you can sell it for up to $100,000. So the chondropython, when it's afraid, it sits on a stick like that. The related ball python, there's a $20,000 ball python, is named for its fear response. When ball pythons are afraid, they curl up tight in a little ball. So these are terrified snakes with people all around them. Green tree pythons, chondropythons, when they're adults, they usually turn green. But here is a sign from one of the vendors offering a money-back guarantee if the snake turns green. What's valued in these species is new kinds of color. And to produce those new kinds of color, they're often producing these very sick animals that are suffering from the moment they're born. So there's a picture of a lizard from Afghanistan. And we're talking about thousands of animals that are brought together. These are cheap. You can get them for $55. I see another one, $75. Colorful lizards. People value this novelty in color. These snakes, I found, really don't want to live with people. They'd rather just die. So there's a queer theorist, Sarah Ahmed, who talks about what she calls affect aliens. So if you've ever walked in a room when other people are laughing, and you wonder if they're laughing at you or laughing at something else, that's one way of understanding how you can be alienated from the dominant affect in a room. She also describes the figure of the unhappy bride on her wedding day, when the social expectation is for someone to be happy, but you're really sad or experiencing all sorts of complicated emotions. So here I found a bubble of happiness and speculation, economic speculation, in human worlds surrounding these snakes. But the snakes themselves were deeply unhappy. And happiness for Sarah Ahmed is a super interesting and complicated thing, right? So she traces the origin of the word happiness to Old English. So being happy means being full of hap. So hap is like happenstance. It's something involving contingency, chance encounter. So these snakes basically live curled up in balls in these tiny little cages because they're afraid, because there's these big animals hovering around them, occasionally feeding them dead baby rats. But some of the snakes have simply refused to eat. They don't want to participate in this economy. They'd rather just die. So the people who are in charge of the people who are keeping them and hoping to make money off of them, who are keeping these sick animals alive, have figured out how to basically do the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay nasal tube feeding. They figured out how the gag reflex works. So they take a dead baby rodent, jam it down the snake's throat, pass the gag reflex. If it spits it out, they pick it up again and stick it right back down in. So they're breeding these unhappy animals even when they just really want to die. So the story of frogs is somewhere in the middle. It's, if they're birds that are arguably happy in households like Caroline's, I think, there's some stories of frogs where, there are affect aliens, frogs that aren't doing so well, aren't very happy in human households. And then there's other stories of frogs that are flourishing. And I'm going to tell you about this frog. The lemur leaf frog is an arguably very cute frog. A lot of people in the pet trade grew attached to it. It's from the highlands of Costa Rica, and it's in danger of extinction right now because there's this fungal disease that's killing it. So people brought it to the United States before it was labeled as an endangered species. So it was perfectly legal what they did, but the question is whether or not that was ethical. So these frogs respond to human desires to touch. They are very interactive, they're social. They like to be, out and about. But they don't survive particularly well in captivity. There's a group who tried to do first the institutionalized work of saving endangered species. So it's not just that one frog that's in danger of extinction right now. We're talking about 2,000 species of frogs. And in 2008, the same year that the financial cataclysm happened, this organization, the Amphibian Ark, tried to raise money. They didn't know that the financial collapse was about to happen. They'd been planning for this event for years. They named 2008 the Year of the Frog, and they started this big fundraising campaign. They tried to raise $50 million, which they said was enough to keep these endangered forms of life alive and protected from this fungal disease. But instead of raising $50 million, they barely raised enough money to pay their basic operating expenses. So this organization that called itself the Amphibian Ark barely stayed afloat. So of those 2,000 species, they were only able to muster enough resources to save 10 in official zoos and aquariums. They've established biosecure breeding facilities. They've frozen some frog tissue in the hopes of reanimating it once the technology gets better. So that leaves 1,990 species that are on the brink of extinction, that are going to go extinct unless people do something. So back to the story of the lemur leaf frog, and here's sort of a related frog and some of the material culture, the stuff that you can buy at the pet store to keep frogs alive. This organization called Tree Walkers International tried to start doing that work of lively capital to bring commerce into play with ethical sensibilities about keeping frogs in captivity. So they tried to take lemur leaf frogs and find a new home for them in people's living rooms and bedrooms and garages. And at the same time that habitat for these frogs is being destroyed by coffee plantations, as this disease is killing them in the wild, they tried to create new bubbles of hope and happiness here in North America. So they started a concerted breeding program working with people who had this love for frogs. Not that sort of heavy petting kind of love that Peter Singer describes, but a more platonic love, a love that involves care, a love that involves care for not only individual animals, but kinds of animals, a form of care that might keep these creatures in the world, even as they're orphaned from their ecosystems. So they started this breeding program in a network of hobbyists, people who weren't getting paid to do this, but sort of took it upon themselves to try to care for these animals and care for the species. But they found that the lemur leaf frog didn't work out so well in human households. The population has this big boom and bust cycle, so they produce a lot of eggs, a lot of tadpoles. Those frogs are distributed through the network, but they found that they quickly died. So this project around the lemur leaf frog collapsed. Here's the lemur leaf frog. I went to this guy, and he just posted these pictures on the internet. He was offering them for sale for $30, so you could buy these endangered frogs for $30. But when I approached him last year, when I was writing about the book and trying to figure out if I too could be involved in caring for the species, he told me he didn't have any more. And I've been looking online, and basically they can't be found. So basically these frogs are not only endangered in Costa Rica, they're now endangered in the North American pet trade. There's laws right now, you can't import these frogs anymore. And those laws are in place to prevent people from going to the wild populations and having that collection pressure be part of what's driving them extinct. But there's hope that they're going to revitalize that breeding population and keep it alive. But at this point, the jury's out. It doesn't seem like a species that's good at living with people, living in our households. So I'm now working with a different frog species. This is Phyllobates vittatus. And I'm going to actually be giving these frogs away. So in caring for these frogs, you need to learn how to care for mutants. So I'm just going to go around the room and pass out these mutants. This is part of a giveaway project. I've been giving away mutant fruit flies. So these are food for frogs. And if you choose to take these into your house, and you don't have to care for these flies only to give them to frogs as food. I'm running out here. I'll let you share. So part of this, I want people to think about how to care for the forms of life that are unloved in this era of extinction, right? So insects are often killable, right? Insects are kinds of life that many people exterminate. And these fruit flies here have a mutation that lets them be more adaptable to human households. And if you want to take these home with you, you can sort of, there's a limited supply, you can sort of fight over who gets it. But if you want to take it home with you, write your email address. If you don't want it, you can give it to somebody else. So these flies don't fly anymore. They have a mutation that basically limits them from flying. So they're easier to take care of. They're easier for us to breed. They're less likely to become a pest in your household. They're also easier for the frogs to eat. So the key thing to keeping these endangered frogs alive in an urban landscape dominated by people is caring for the right kind of food. So I've been giving away these mutants, and these just came back to me. So I did the first mutant giveaway in February, and someone brought me, at the second event I did, 1,280 flies in return. I just had another event over the weekend at the opening of this art show, and Celeste, who brought all these, she brought me 2,270. So at the end of this competition, it's basically a competition to see who can raise the most fruit flies. So the person who wins this competition is going to get a Phyllobates vittatus. So these frogs are a lot like the lemur leaf frogs. So Phyllobates vittatus has a similar story. They're endangered in Costa Rica because of habitat loss, also because of this fungal disease. What we're trying to do with this frog, because it's better adapted to living with humans, is create sort of a momentary bubble of happiness here in the United States, figure out how to breed this frog to numbers that we can reintroduce to Costa Rica. So in contrast to the lemur leaf frog, these guys do relatively well with human households. They don't like to be touched. They don't respond well to human desires to like hold them and cradle them. They're a shy frog. So I've got a pair of them right now living in the art gallery in Brooklyn, and everybody who came to the opening wanted to see the frogs. But the frogs really don't want to be seen. They like to hang out under, I've got like a bunch of plants in this aquarium. So in addition to the frog, I'm giving away this vivarium that has all sorts of moss and plant life, sort of an ideal habitat for these guys to live. When people are around, they like to hide. They burrow into the mud. They've got a little hole that they like. There's little plants that hang out. But they're beautiful. They're tiny. They're about the size of my thumb knuckle. And they've got a really beautiful call. So they're not going to be social animals. They're not going to be like Caroline's birds, or they're not going to be like these lemur leaf frogs that you can pet or touch. But they're forms of life that you can care for. They're, you know, if you choose to, you could help be part of the story of enabling these animals to flourish in the future. So one possible future for these frogs, again, is reintroducing them, but we've got to go through a lot of red tape. So before sending them back, we have to make sure that they're not carrying any diseases. So the San Diego Zoo has partnered with me before, and they've got expertise to sort of help decide if it's a good thing. You know, there's, in addition to that fungal disease I talked about, frogs can pick up ranavirus. Frogs can pick up all sorts of diseases, things that are harmless to people, but that could be harmful to other kinds of frogs back in Costa Rica. So one possible flourishing is, you know, we find a new place for them in Costa Rica, a place where they won't be in competition with other frogs. But maybe, you know, the ecological situation has changed so much in Costa Rica that human households are the only places where these things can continue to live. So if you choose to take home some flies, bring them back 12 noon, Saturday, May 21st. That's the address of where to bring them. And here's a web address where you can get more details about the giveaway and you know, and the meat and fruit fly exchange. So yeah, it's you know, it's a project meant to be interactive, meant to get you thinking about that real question that I opened up at the beginning. You know, who to love in an era of extinction, and also how to love. You know, what forms of love do we want to practice? It's really consequential and high stakes to decide who to love, who to care for. You know, and when you decide to love one kind of life, say this charismatic frog, it involves death for other kinds of life, these flies. So, you know, you might choose to take the flies home with you and just care for the flies. Let them go wild in new kinds of ways. So you can get these yourself. You can buy them online with a credit card, these mutant fruit flies. There's a website called edsflymeat.com. Basically, mutants are proliferating and running wild all around you. So I've helped these mutants flourish in new ways. Some have escaped on the G train in Brooklyn. Others have been sighted in Queens. They're also in Manhattan. So instead of caring for this frog, maybe you decide that you want to care for these insects and let them flourish in new places. So I'm going to just read a little bit in conclusion here. So that key question from Emergent Ecologies, how and who should we love in an era of extinction, often comes with preordained answers in line with dominant political projects and economic interests. Political ideas about belonging offer seemingly simple plans of action. Kill the aliens, kill the invasive species, love the natives. Chemical industries with vested economic interests in monocrop agriculture offer answers based on the same kind of deadly distinctions. Poison the pests, kill the crops. Conservation practitioners, policymakers, and farmers are already starting to move beyond these simple distinctions. People are realizing that political communities are no longer homogenous. So, you know, Donald Trump thinks that he can mobilize a certain electorate. But a lot of communities are starting to move beyond xenophobic discourses of the 20th century. Restoration ecologists and nature lovers are finding that wayward and unpredictable forms of life can generate new niches, habitat, and opportunities for symbiotic attachments, even as they disrupt established assemblages. Again, killing often becomes necessary when one makes commitments to others within ecological communities. Taking a stand for creatures one loves means taking a stand against enemies that present threats to them. So for these frogs, if you were to get a frog and it got sick with this fungal disease, Bacocochytrium dendrobatidis, you'd have to figure out how to kill that disease. And it's actually kind of simple. You can buy Lamisil, this antifungal cream, off the shelf, and create this diluted solution and give your frog a bath. And that can rid it of this disease. But you'd also have to feed the frog, and any kind of food, whether it's plant or animal or whatever. With frogs, it has to be animals. They're not vegetarians or omnivores. They're predators. You've got to kill a kind of life. So here's a kind of life that you could kill to save a frog. So love in these ecological communities means living with the necessary labor of killing. It also means consciously dwelling with the genuine ethical difficulties that accompany attempts to promote good life ways. When we participate in market economies or even grow our own vegetables, we're casting our lots with some ways of life and not others. Life and death are at stake every time we eat, buy clothes at the store, flip an electric light switch. We can't get outside of entanglements with powerful assemblages that deal out bad deaths, cascading chains of destruction in ecological communities that have led many environmental advocates to sadness and to cynicism. Despite a groundswell of popular action, global climate change might be something we can't solve. Capitalist enterprises are rapidly destroying forests and wetlands in diverse corners of the globe. We might not be able to stop that. Recognizing these new facts of life have led many to feelings of futility. There's critics you'll find at the university that criticize everybody for being complicit in these assemblages, but these critics are doing little to love, to live, or to fight. Alongside legions of cynical critics, as well as communities of experts and working professionals that are working to promote corporate and government interests, in doing research for this book, I found a multitude of tinkerers and thinkers who are transforming feelings of futility into concrete action, cynicism into happiness and hope. This multitude is forging convivial alliances, exploring wild possibilities. They're sustaining multi-species families, tending compost bins, sorting through the detritus of capitalism. These creative agents are caring for things and beings that are ready at hand. I found organic intellectuals who are gardening in the ruins, finding delectable fruits and mushrooms in blasted landscapes, finding new companions while wandering through haunted and weedy wrecks. There are microbes that are awakening pleasures in us that eclipse purely utilitarian calculations, animals and plants that stir our interests and desires, that are using us to multiply their forces. In closing, I ask, what sort of novel ecological assemblages might we build together? Can we construct new ecosystems while embracing social justice concerns, while grappling with the subjective experiences of other forms of life, and upholding conservation values all at the same time? Can we craft tactful proposals to those who we love, offering links to our social worlds and industrial supply chains while keeping windows open that might give them opportunities to escape? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eben. We're going to open it up to questions. Take your time. If you have any. I have a couple to start off with. You talked a lot about how and who we love when these interspecies relationships. Perhaps you can talk a little more about who and how we're allowed to love as well, because that's part of this sort of separation, right?
Yeah, for starters, I might add, before you bring fruit flies to your dorm, you might ask what the rules are. So within a university context, animals without backbones are not treated as subjects of ethical regard. So if you apply for a big grant like the National Science Foundation, you don't have to get ethics clearance to work with fruit flies because they don't have backbones and they're deemed killable. You can do whatever you want to an insect. You can exterminate it. So there probably aren't actually rules against having fruit flies in your dorm room. Is there a policy about pets on campus? What's the pet policy?
You're only allowed to have fish.
Fish.
Like no hamsters, not like that, just fish. And it has to be like a small thing too.
So I think you could argue that these forms of life are even, more amenable to dorm life than a fish. That's the argument that I would make. So you can choose to take these to your dorm room, or you could choose to take them to a local trash can and let them flourish there, or to your parents' basement and let them flourish there, or drop them off in a neighbor's mailbox that you don't like and let them flourish there, and occasionally add bananas into the mailbox. So there's all sorts of norms about who we should love that influence not only the choices that we make in terms of a sexual partner, but what sort of companion animals might inhabit spaces with us. So I guess my challenges and the ones that I'm trying to offer up to you is to think about subjects that are often deemed unlovable, to think about these unloved others in this era of mass extinction, whether those unloved others are actively vilified and targeted for death, like a lot of insects, or whether those unloved others are just sort of slipping from our imagination because we don't have the storytelling practices to make them visible yet. So I told stories about maybe like 3 kinds of frogs today. There's a lot of other frogs that I don't have time to tell you stories about. So, in thinking about how to love and who to love, I think, critically addressing those processes that make, some forms of life allowable in our intimate spaces and other forms of life outlawed. And maybe also think about the ways that you deal out death, too. Like, I'm sure we've all probably killed an insect in this room.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of the queer aspects of this kind of definition of love that you've talked about, interspecies love, just to flesh it out a little bit more, the sort of theoretical implications of and the impetus from queer thinking, queer theory, queer study.
Yeah, so I must admit, for starters, I'm a relative newcomer to queer theory. The folks that I mobilize in this book, Sarah Ahmed, Lauren Berland, who talks about cruel optimism, Kath Weston, who talks about these families that one might form not on the basis of blood or kinship, but on the basis of sort of affection, affiliation. I think offer some really interesting resources for thinking through the forms of attachment that one might develop with other forms of life. This sort of non-reproductively oriented forms of attachment, affection, and in some of these cases, kinky sex, where 80-year-old women are having sex with birds. I mean, it's I think a pervasive thing that's under-theorized right now. So I think sort of the taboo of those forms of touching, I think is a really potent site for creative, theoretical, and artistic intervention right now. So I don't know, I'd actually love to hear, because you all in this room know a lot more about queer theory than me, so I'd love to hear what you all think.
To me, a large part of the queerness of all of this is in terms of language and classification and exactly those boundaries of who's allowed to be loved and in what ways are they allowed to be loved. And once again, also going back to questions of legality in all spheres, right? Beyond just classification biologically, but socially, legally, ethically, all of these things. So I think that's where the queerness becomes very clear in a way, especially when you kind of bring in also the issue of consent. I mean, and that's something that is interesting. I mean, you don't. In some ways, we sort of assumed that there is no consent here, right? How does one deal with issues of consent in this context?
Yeah, I think the question for me often in these households was like, is the human consenting? Because a lot of times, the bird and I had a bird land on my hand, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, what's going on here? I didn't agree to this. And I think probably most of us in this room at one point or another have had a dog like come up and be very excited about her leg. So, I think. The regimes of consent that work in human worlds, where sort of like risk is mitigated by like the signing of forms in a research context, or where like well-meaning young awkward teenagers on the first date are like, "Can I kiss you? Is it okay?" And I think often issues of consent in human worlds are more about these corporeal experiments, like tentatively touching and seeing if it's accepted, and learning how to do, to make these tactful proposals that could be rejected in a polite way. But so I guess maybe it's trying to theorize. I think it's rare in human worlds, or when someone does pop the question like, "Can I kiss you?" Like often, like no, because you haven't sent the right body language, and my body language hasn't like accepted your proposal. So I guess maybe it's like thinking through, maybe these like queer interspecies encounters might refract like some of the assumptions that we take, like how do you really ask someone for permission to kiss them? I think it's often a much more subtle thing than just popping the question.
Completely, and also giving frogs or the birds the agency that they of their own sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah, this questions. Trish, you want to go?
I want to follow up on your question of consent. It seems like that's related to, again, queer theory, to the question of exploitation. Mm-hmm. So you've got a captive person there. And there's some question about whether captive creatures can give consent, even if we're not talking about the same kind of agency. This bird is very attracted to Caroline, wants to get with Caroline, but partly that may be because the bird is being exploited in some sense by being held captive. It doesn't have the particular options that somebody like maybe Tom Regan would talk about, the ability to engage in natural behaviors. The bird is experiencing what you might call an ethical deprivation harm, and in the context of experiencing that deprivation harm is exploited, and then Carolyn's hand becomes a reasonable option. So consent and exploitation.
Absolutely.
I guess just to kind of flesh out the queer theory aspects of this.
These are that occur to power again, right? Who holds the power? There's an old joke from the northern areas of Pakistan about the region where men are men and the sheep are scared.
Isn't that the Midwest?
Is that? Yeah. Well, so I guess that's sort of the question, right? Which I think is what you're talking about, Trish, is, sexuality and power and freedom to, so consent can only have meaning, right, when you're on an equal footing. And that's the thing that is a little bit problematic in this for me.
So part of what I'm trying to do, building on Haraway, is get past this notion that fantasy of equality might ever get actualized, and to sort of queer the very idea of nature itself, and suggest that it's sort of nature and culture, natural cultural hybrids all the way down. So Donna Haraway's written about the possibilities of flourishing for dogs in human households, and not sort of celebrating the possibility of egalitarian equality, but look for the possibilities of flourishing in a household where dominance hierarchies enable a sort of flourishing in an urban landscape that would otherwise be dangerous for the dog, right? So to be a dog in New York City, or to be a dog in Santa Cruz, where Donna Haraway's writing, the dog has to be, if they don't know how to read like a traffic signal, or if they don't know how to pay attention to speeding cars, paying attention to that command, sit, stay, is a life and death thing. So she's looking at possibilities of flourishing in those never equal relationships, and trying to theorize the possibility of play, reciprocity, and innovation in those sort of contact zones. And that word contact zone, that phrase, is drawing on post-colonial theory. So it comes from Mary Louise Pratt to think about these situations of culture contact and situations of very extreme power asymmetry. So basically, New Guinea, where I've done my earlier work, and rather than try to explore teleologies that directions that lead towards equality, egalitarian fantasies of utopia, Mary Louise Pratt has looked at the possibilities of improvisation and play, not only culture loss, deculturation, or learning the new dominant culture, acculturation, but what she calls neoculturation, the possibility of flourishing within that situation of sort of extreme hierarchy and dominance. So I think in these households that I'm describing, where and I think there's a parallel for human households too. Like, we can't really choose who our parents are, right? Like when you're a kid, if you run away from home, like the cops pick you up and take you back, unless you have a really good, compelling story, or unless you have like physical signs of violence on your body, you're put right back where you ran away from. So I think like these issues of coercion, of domination that are happening in these multi-species households, the fact that you can't, choose who your parents are, you can't choose who your owners are. I think again, like the dynamics that I'm trying to describe here might deflect and diffract and give us a new point of entry to thinking about these relations in human worlds.
In some ways, just to comment on that, it feels like it's really about talking rather than the large-scale sort of equality, trying to find ways to make equality or to flip the power relationship in the moment in sort of micro ways, right? And to be more pragmatic about this relationship as opposed to utopian.
And to work towards maybe what I call in the book momentary bubbles of happiness. So it's not that like any of these situations are utopic, and like if anyone's been in a long-term monogamous romance with another person, like relationships are difficult. You got to work through issues. So yeah, momentary bubbles of happiness rather than sort of any sort of final teleology.
It's all contingent in any case, I guess.
Yes. I mean, for Foucauldian, the notion of power is not always just unique, directional. So we know that. I mean, it's there are ways to work with that. The privilege. This is interesting work.
Harry talks about openings as well, right? Like making small openings that you can then sort of chip away, as opposed to trying to change things completely.
You had your hand up.
You had your hand up for a while.
So my question was, when these animals are exposed to this queer behavior, does it affect how they behave towards other animals of the same species?
We actually haven't looked at that yet, but like going back to Caroline's household, like the little bird that had sex with her hand had lots of opportunities for sex with birds, but I didn't hang out there long enough to see, if he preferred people to birds. I know of one bird that I lived with, my ex-girlfriend's bird, named Cornflakes, who definitely preferred people to birds, and got upset when other birds would come around. Although he did have a particular affection with the bird in the mirror. He would regurgitate food and try to feed the bird in the mirror. So I think he loved himself, but I'm not sure if he loved other birds.
It's just like expressing another level of narcissism within animals.
Or maybe he was just gay, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to the kind of original question here, that we're talking about queer sciences, and we're just kind of going into all the ethics of what it is to have a interspecies relationship with another animal. I think we kind of just basically blew over the fact that we're actually talking about an interspecies relationship with another animal, like people. Like this would never have been brought up where I'm from. It's just like no, like not even like hinting at with like animal, and it's just like no, and they don't go into the reasons why it's a no. It's kind of like an overall no, whether it's like like ethics towards animal or just like people are almost considered higher than animals, so like having any kind of relationship that rather than pattern it would be considered just wrong.
To even talk about it as a relationship would be problematic
Yeah.
in some other contexts.
So it's just like kind of amazing to have this conversation because like your whole life everything just kind of like this is like the wrong and you don't talk about it, don't think about it, it's just like no. Now we're like opening the door to this conversation.
And I mean, some religions, I mean, certainly I know that in Islam, for example, for whatever, I mean, I have never understood why dogs are unclean, considered unclean. So you can't, if you're about to pray, and after you've done your ablution, you can't have a dog, suddenly come along or be in that space or even touch that dog. I mean, I still remember my grandmother. I mean, there's a word for that. It's palit, it's like you can't do that. So, I mean, the question opens, but the question we're raising is really important, I think. It's about sort of also a question of changing the way we think about human and animal sort of relationships and also valuing animal life in a way that I don't think a lot of people spend their time thinking about, especially depending on the cultural and religious and other kinds of situations or circumstances in which they're raised. So there's there's definitely a lot of usefulness to this kind of thinking. I think it opens up that space. I just have a problem with the idea, and I guess that's because we're raised that way, when you can't communicate through verbal language. I don't know how you read the nonverbal, right? Because, what is that? Yeah, that to me is very...
But in a
it's hard to
way,
really
it
get
goes
my head
back
around
to
it.
queer
Huh?
theory, right? It goes back to queer theory by giving up the primacy of the spoken written
Yeah.
word and finding and sort of proliferating other ways of speaking, per se, right? Which is part also proliferating other ways of having relationships, who we have relationships with. All of that is part of queering in a way, right? Is this idea of biological exuberance, which also then translates to social exuberance, to all kinds of ways of having and of imagining families, which also kind of ties into queerness, because that's what sort of queerness allows for, is to imagine different ways of having families, right? Our chosen families. So, in a way, what would it mean in that particular instance to give other species that right to choose us as families as well?
So it looks like we're out of time, but
Yeah.
maybe collect 2 quick questions, and then I'll deliver answers after everybody leaves. If yeah.
It's like a two-part question. So basically, like having some knowledge on animals, like the animal kingdom. Like there's very few animals that engage in sexual intercourse for pleasure. So I was just wondering if like a bird like a parakeet would have, if it's an interspecies relationship, would have like erotic feelings towards a human, or is it like, is there breeding patterns? I don't know what's it called when a bird, like what's a bird breeding pattern? And there was another one. I lost that.
Maybe if you
Yeah.
you want to go really quick, and if it comes back to you.
Oh, I wasn't actually so much going to ask the question. I was going to make a statement because we were trying to connect this to queer theory, and I think that some people are troubled by this because the relationship between these animals and humans are existing outside of something that's normative. So your regular interaction with a frog or a bird in nature is accepted by our society, but when you bring that into a different sphere, from the public sphere to the private sphere, I think that's what makes this a queer science.
Yeah. So maybe just like a really quick fact that I want to report as you guys are leaving is that I found this frog having gay sex, and I was an anthropologist tagging along on a biology biology experiment, and they found that that was happening, but did not report it in the scientific literature because they thought it was irrelevant, uninteresting, not scientifically reportable. But there's a whole book by Joan Ruffgarden called Evolution's Rainbow, where she surveys like lizards and fish and all sorts of animals that have gay sex.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I just thought it was interesting that I like observed this along with this team of biologists who was studying reproduction and mating, but they were just like, oh, it's not relevant, and they wouldn't even let me put it in a footnote in this paper that we wrote. So yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.